Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. It's Bob Jones speaking for the CACOR organization. This is going to be our 179th straight Zoom session, and we're looking forward to hearing from our speaker, Geoff Strong. On the screen at the moment is a text of what Geoff has done and achieved, and I'm not going to read that. I'm just going to be a little informal with the introduction, and then we'll get right into it because I hear Geoff's got at least 50 minutes of interesting stuff for us. He talked to us last about 2 years ago to the month, and at that time it was the climate crisis and net zero, and today it's immoralities of climate change. So Geoff is right on target there. He's written a couple of books, Convenient Mistruths and Inconvenient Pipelines, and those are of great interest. And third and fourth books are in progress as well. Geoff walks the talk when it comes to the climate crisis. He understands the science. He knows what's going on. He knows about the poly crisis. He knows about a lot of the stuff that all of our other speakers have been referencing, and he is concerned for everybody on the planet, of course, but he uses the standard phraseology of God, our grandchildren. We've got to make sure that we have a better place for our grandchildren. And this is where I think Geoff excels, because his first two books are fictional characters, but they're directed at readers like the grandchildren, and they're very animated, and they show experience of people, real people could be experiencing what goes on in climate change. So these books, who knows, we might have another Greta Thunberg emerging. I hope they're being read, and Geoff definitely deserves a second round here at CACOR. And without further ado, I will let Geoff take over now with his next version of what's going on in climate change. Geoff?
Okay, so good morning or afternoon to everyone. And I just want to make a little bit of a clarification here. When we scheduled this talk, I think September or something like that, it was Garth Mahalchan and I were going to talk about immoralities, the climate crisis. I handled the science and the impacts, and he was going to handle the immoralities. Well, Garth was sick most of this fall with flu and various things. He even spent some time in hospital in both Calgary and Duncan, and he begged off. So I'm going to take it from there. So it won't be a lot on immoralities. But anyway, so what you see on the screen then are some of the recent impacts of climate change in Canada. I think the first the two slides there are from the town of Lytton, where they lost most of the homes in that town. I had the opportunity to go up this past fall and viewed what went on there. Everything is all cleared out now, and they're waiting to get funding, I suppose, to start rebuilding. But and then last year, of course, we had extreme wildfires in every province in Canada and every territory. And the picture I'm showing there on the bottom there is, I think, from looking across Lake, the Okanagan Lake across to the west side. And apparently the people on the west side were given less than an hour's notice to evacuate. A lot of them left their, does my cursor show up here? Anyway, so a lot of them left their lights on in the lower part there, and I can picture, I don't know who took this photo, but I can picture them standing there and waiting to see if those fires are going to burn down their home with everything in it. They didn't have any time to move on. And in 2021, we had also atmospheric moisture rivers that in lower BC anyway, with flooding caused some $450 million damage, and there were 5 deaths. This is a crude picture of the rainfall. I'm not sure the source, and I'm not sure of the values. If they say greater than 10 centimeters or 100 millimeters. Well, I don't know if you see my cursor, but we're in Cowichan Bay, and I operate a rain gauge every morning. And through that 24-hour period, I recorded 200 millimeters or 20 centimeters of rainfall. I've never seen anything like it before.
This is Dave. Geoff, yes, we do see your cursor.
Okay, good. I'll try not to wag it around too much. Just a second. So we have these new terms that come into the lexicon of meteorology: heat dome and atmospheric river. Two new terms in the last couple of years, and I see them being used in other parts of the world as well. And then in September of last year, we had a number of hurricanes. Fiona in particular struck Nova Scotia, PEI, and the southwest coast of Newfoundland. We're looking at a house that's been taken off its moorings there, and it looks like it's going to tumble into the ocean. That was in Port aux Basques, the ferry terminal in Newfoundland. And there were two houses washed out to sea from that town, with two ladies were in them. They managed to rescue one. I can't imagine anyone having the courage to go out in that sea to rescue someone, but they did. So hats off to them. Just a few days later, there was a Hurricane Ian that came out of the Gulf of Mexico and struck Florida. $75 billion damage and 150 deaths. And the point I want to make is that all of these things were well covered by media all around the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, even down into the Southern Hemisphere, because of what happened. But where the climate change impacts are worse has always been in the subtropics for the last 30 years. And here's a couple of pictures from Yemen and Somalia, where they suffer mostly from desertification caused by global warming and resulting drought, loss of water and arable land, and eventually famines. And the accompanying story that I stole this picture from said that this little guy there, they didn't expect him to last another 24 hours. He's quite emaciated. And the lady in this picture here in Somalia, she had two children died. You can see the mounds there. All she was able to do, she had enough strength and resources to drag them out on the ground and just cover them over with clay and stones. And now she's sitting there unable to move, I suppose. So that's the story from the subtropics. Now, this is some of the earlier countries that were struck in the Sahel region, and even now northern parts of Uganda and Kenya are drying out. They have severe drought in those countries. And I'll remind you that Kenya actually extends across the equator, I believe, but even the northern part of that, close to the equator, is suffering drought. So what are the immoralities of the climate crisis? And now these are my opinions, okay? So who are the guilty parties? Well, obviously, fossil fuel corporations. They have mostly profit-driven goals. They cheat on emissions reporting. They cherry-pick data, for example, and sometimes don't report data. They cover up oil spills. And that was the subject of my second novel, Inconvenient Pipeline, where the story is really about, my novels are fiction in terms of the characters and the events, but the science in it, I hope, is pretty accurate. So this was really about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but I dared not use that name for fear of libel after. So, but that's what it concerns. So these corporations, they pay denialists to emphasize uncertainties and possible errors in climate change. They don't pay them directly. They use these think tanks and direct the think tank to provide funding for climate denialists to do these things. And one here in Canada, notoriously, is the Fraser Institute right here in BC. And earlier, when I lived in Edmonton, we, my colleague and I uncovered a similar one at the University of Calgary, which is a hotbed of climate denialists, or it was, and it's turning that around now. Governments who listen to fossil fuel corporations, but often not to their own scientists. The climate plans that Canada has worked on is put together by policy managers, I guess, none of whom I don't believe are scientists. And I doubt very much that they even talk to climate scientists within Environment and Climate Change Canada, where they have quite a bit of expertise. And then, of course, the climate denialists. First of all, those accepting pay from fossil fuels to deny climate change, blame it on other sources, for example, a solar cycle or volcanoes or just about anything. And their job is just to suggest uncertainties in climate science, that it's still under debate. But of course, the debate about the climate change theory was resolved way back in the 1890s by Swedish scientist Sven Arrhenius. Then there are those who deny climate change, refuse to accept scientific results. They promote disinformation. They're very much the same as people who believe contrails are chemtrails, and the freedom truckers and the non-vaxxers. These are people who have little science in their own background, and they get up their back against science and promote this disinformation. Then there are inactivists, those who understand and see what is wrong, but do not speak up. Now, Seth Klein, in his book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, he refers to these people as the new climate denialists. And then there are those who simply say the world is doomed and action is futile. They produce nothing in society anyway, and they are also classed among these. So I'll go on. Carbon emissions and the role that industry, government, and the public play in it. So we have the three wise monkeys who speak no evil, see no evil, and hear no evil. The speak no evil, I list among them fossil fuel corporations, forestry corporations, not forestry science, but banks who fund fossil fuels and other things like mining and that. And they provide they give information to. I got my list of participants here is blocking what I see here. They provide information to governments that's often tainted, and to media. And those two provide information to the public who are basically misled unless they know some science, who hear no evil. Okay, so just a second here. I'm having trouble seeing what I have on the screen myself. But anyway, carbon emissions and climate change and whatnot, and the temperature change that occur. This is atmospheric carbon dioxide as they measure at Mauna Loa Observatory. The carbon emissions that are reported have errors of emission because I say they are cherry picked, but nature does not lie. So you can believe in this trend here. That's what's up in the air above us. And a couple of days ago, we hit 423.4 parts per million. And the importance of that is it's over 4 parts per million higher than what it was at the same date last year. So this is not a straight line, it's an exponential curve. In other words, atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing more and more every year. And likewise, if you look at the global temperature anomalies, and from the same time, this was started in the late 50s, and the temperature trends follow the same trend. And I'll add on just to 2023. I'm a bit of guesswork here because we still don't have December data, but it's going to be very close to 1.5 degrees, which is a level that IPC says we should be stopping it. So as carbon emissions increase, so does atmospheric carbon dioxide, but likewise, as the carbon dioxide increases, so have carbon emissions. It's a one-to-one kind of thing. But many countries report decreasing emissions, including Canada. And nature does not lie. And I don't know about individual countries, but globally, we know from this diagram here that carbon emissions are still increasing because nature doesn't lie. On the temperature trend here, global mean temperatures also increase as a result of this, of course. And our 2023 temperature anomaly will be very close to 1.5 degrees, that magic level. And in 2024, we're now expecting it to exceed that. Here's the diagram from, this is from the ECMWF, or the, whoa. Sorry about that. I just lost my slide. So the reference period for this is 1991 to 2020, and that's why you don't see 1.5 degrees on this up here. So that's the zero line, and it goes from the 1940s right up until the 2020s, and includes 2016, which was the warmest year on record until this year, and you can see this year that it's far exceeded that right here. And just a glance at that tells you that that 2023 is going to be labeled as the warmest year on record. Okay, so I mentioned positive feedbacks and tipping point in the climate, and I want to try and explain those terms. And first of all, a question, how has global warming accelerated in the last 2 to 5 years? Well, it occurs with increased carbon emissions and any positive feedbacks to the warming. And those positive feedbacks are not positive for humanity, of course. And here's some examples. I'll just give 2 or 3 examples. As the atmosphere warms by, let's say, 2 degrees Celsius, its capacity to hold water vapor increases. So the amount of water vapor in the air is totally dependent on the average atmospheric temperature, no other variable there. And with 2 degrees warming, it would increase 15 to 20 degrees, 15 to 20% in terms of vapor mass in the atmosphere. And water vapor is the most potent greenhouse gas. We don't often mention that. It doesn't come up much in climate change talk, simply because on a year-to-year basis, the atmosphere is only warming by like 1/10 of a degree or so each time. And so it's not considered to be that important. But now it's becoming important as we get up to between 1.5 and 2 degrees C because of this factor. Another, and so, let me just go back there. As the atmosphere warms, then it allows more water vapor into the atmosphere, which allows more warming, which allows more water vapor. So you see the kind of cycle you get into there. In terms of ice melt in the Arctic over both land and the Arctic Ocean, as the atmosphere warms, you see more ice melt in the Arctic. For example, this is the ice that's disappeared during summer from 1979 to 2000. And of course, ice and snow, a fresh ice and snow surface reflects 90 to 95% of incoming solar radiation. And once you remove that, for example, over the sea here, there's less reflection of the solar radiation. And then the water and the land start absorbing more ice. In addition, of course, melting land ice increases sea level rise. So as you remove the ice and snow, you're getting more absorption of heat by the land and the ocean and the atmosphere, which causes even more melting. And again, you're going to a cycle. Here's an important one, but we really don't know exactly how much there is of northern permafrost melt going on. But beneath the, I'll just go to this photo here, which shows that in subarctic regions, you do get grasses and that growing over some soil that's collected on top. This is the permafrost layer. And when that melts, then this whole thing collapses, and that's what's happened here. And these are peat bogs, and as they start to decompose, they release more methane if they're wet, as this is, or if it's dry, they release carbon dioxide. In any event, the chemical reactions in the chemistry of the atmosphere dictates that some of the methane that breaks down into carbon dioxide as well, and either one are global warmers. And there are other positive feedbacks. Some people list 8, 10 of them, but I won't go into any of the other details. These are what I regard as the most important ones. Now, if those start to work together at the same time, simultaneously, that's what can cause accelerated warming. And that may or may not be what's happened in the last couple of years. I'm uncertain of that, as anyone else is. What is a tipping point in nature? I just want to explain that then. There are two major processes of restoring equilibrium by nature. And that's dynamic and what we call metastable equilibrium. Other disciplines define other subsets of these subsets, but mostly there's just these two. Dynamic equilibrium occurs when the rate of gain equals the rate of loss, whether you're talking about these high frequency components or something like that. And that could be a temperature change or the price of oranges in China, for all I know. But when the rate of gain equals the rate of loss, the system returns to a stable condition like that. And the best example of that are weather systems. In some area of the ocean or the land, you'll sometimes get a convergence of heat and moisture. And because of the Coriolis force, that starts to rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, clockwise in the southern. And that's what happens with the weather system. And then that weather system is moved by the westerlies, the main westerlies, eastward and northeastward. And as it goes, it drops out that heat and moisture and restores equilibrium. And it's a perfect example of dynamic equilibrium and why we're able to model the atmosphere and produce numerical weather predictions. And then there's metastable equilibrium, where the rate of gain is greater than the rate of loss, or negative. It could go negative as well. And the system can't return to a stable level. But we know that you can reach a threshold or a tipping point where nature says, okay, I can't maintain this any longer, so I'm going to move it. And they lurch it to a new operational level, such as that. But the point is, the system never returns to the same. Now, the best example of that are volcanoes. Using the example of Mount St. Helens, here's a picture of the north slope of Mount St. Helens the day before it erupted in 1980. And this is what it looked like after. And these two photos are taken from the same location on that ridge there. So you can see all this vegetation there just disappeared immediately, instantaneously with the explosion. And there's some lakes and that were in there that literally boiled off all the water. Every animal, thousands of animals in there were wiped out. And some 55 to 60 idiot humans who went in to watch the explosion. They knew it was going to occur. They didn't know when, and they disappeared as well. So over the years, that vegetation has come back and the animals and so on have moved back in there. But the system, the volcano, is forever changed. It lost about 500 meters off the top of that mountain. And that's where we worry about our climate. Will it reach a tipping point where we have a sudden, and sudden in this case could amount to years or even a decade or two when the tipping point occurs. But the system is forever changed. It could be left at a very high level of global mean temperature. And that's the danger. They don't talk about it much because it could create chaos and riots. But everything in this century will be affected by, and to a large extent controlled by, climate change. excuse me. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states in its last report in March of last year, this is the first time they brought the words even tipping point out in the open, unless it's hidden in earlier literature, but to avoid a dangerous tipping point in the climate, the world must, they use the word must, reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030, or face a situation where feedbacks may combine to force a sudden rapid warming with multiple lethal impacts all around the globe. I'd add to that we probably should be aiming at a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, 90 to 95% at least by 2040, because that 2040 is approximate date when we could hit 2 degrees Celsius, then or even a couple of years earlier. And I do pick on this, and that was what my previous talk 2 years ago was about. I guess a net zero strategy really should be replaced by the words near zero. And I'm going to say more about that here in a while. But the net zero emission strategy is deceptive and very confusing, and is based on the premise that carbon sequestration techniques can counter current emissions while also drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're really expecting a lot out of net zero emissions. And Canada's methods propose planting trees. First, they said millions of trees. I understand now they're talking of budgeting for 2 to 3 billion trees. I don't know where they're going to get that many seedlings, but anyway. And technology, direct atmospheric capture out of the atmosphere, and carbon capture and storage of at the source of various industries. And but these 3 sequestration techniques are not going to work. I don't mind declaring that openly. Even operating together, they're not going to work. So the question is, why are we wasting so much money on them just for doing those things? So the net zero confusion, is it a misunderstanding, a deception, or a lie? And personally, I think it's a combination of all 3. Now, this is, for me, it's one of the most important diagrams, figures in the last IPCC report of 2023. It's figure SPM 0.5, whatever that means. But it really shows why IPCC regards net zero emissions. To them, it means zero emissions, and to their volunteer scientists who write the reports, that is going carbon neutral by 2050. But that's not the way that governments and industry are looking at it. Just a word about the data here. This is gigatons of equivalent emissions. That includes carbon dioxide and all the other greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is just short of 40 gigatons, and the rest is made up here of the other greenhouse gases equivalency. But notice that their data, their actual data they use, stops here, and that would be about 2017, and they didn't release their report because it takes so much work putting it together with so many scientists until 2023, 6 years later. But in their view, they're saying that emissions should have been capped at a maximum by 2020 and should be reducing very rapidly. They're saying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which we know is no longer possible, by 2050, reaching zero. But they allow some flexibility. That's why this wide area here, and I guess the average is this line here. But the implemented policies of all the 190 or so member nations, this is what their plans will result in. In other words, emissions either staying the same or slightly increasing. A few nations like Germany and the UK, I know 2, for example, have declared that their plan is to actually reduce emissions. But notice that they're all separated from what IPCC declares. So the industry definition of net zero is the difference between current emissions and a baseline level. They have this mistaken belief that warming in any given year, let's say 2023, results from carbon emissions that year. Nothing could be further from the truth. The warming we experience in 2023 is due to the combined or the cumulative emissions of the previous 50 to 100 years. That means that if we were able to magically stop all emissions today, global warming would continue for decades, possibly a century, until it gradually tapered off. And therein lies the problem. So there are two things here. We need to stop or minimize carbon emissions, but we also got to worry about dragging all the carbon that's already in the atmosphere, dragging it back and store it. How we do that, we still don't know, but there's some ideas here. So I am convinced that industry and fossil fuel industry convinced governments all over the world. They're in MP's office in Ottawa almost every day that Parliament is in session. And Canada accepted that baseline idea. They chose 2005 as their baseline when our emissions were 730 megatons. I have to move things around here again so I can see. So the implemented policy suggests that for most countries, including Canada, means holding emissions at or below their baseline value. For Canada, 730 megatons in 2005. Let me just go here. There's the global emissions. And you can see that since 1900, they've been more or less steadily increasing. And there's one outlier here in 2020, emissions decreased only because industries had to shut down all around the world for 1 to 2 months during the initial COVID pandemic. And then, of course, they kept taking off. And I understand now by 2023, we'll be at or above 40 gigatons in carbon dioxide emission. Here's Canada's. I only have the data up to 2019, and this comes right off the Environment Canada website. And there we see the 2005 baseline at 730 megatons. And the idea is to keep emissions at or below that level to achieve net zero. Well, in effect, we've been at net zero emissions ever since, but it's not what we really need, right? And then I found this on a Environment Canada statement, but I don't see I don't see a revision of the diagram. It may be there. I couldn't find it. That in 2021 emissions were down to, I think that's 670 megatons. And I raised questions about that. I don't think they're being dishonest, but I wonder if they're collecting all of the data, because the global one shows things increasing exponentially. So let's have a quick look at Canada's climate plan that was put out. The last version that I saw was March 22, with measures to counter carbon emissions. And there are many things in the plan, and I only pick out 5 what I think are the main ones. First, the carbon tax, which at the pump you're paying on the 1st of April each year. They add 4 cents per liter. So if you drove 10,000 kilometers and your car's economy was 10 kilometers per liter, means you burned 1,000 liters of fuel that year, you'd have paid $40 extra in that first year. Spread over a year, I don't think that hurts very many of us, right? But then the second year, if you're still doing the same, you're going to pay another 4 cents per liter, $80, and so on until 2030 when it maxes out. So people see that on the 1st of April and they start cursing the government for driving them into, oh my, what did I do now? Just a second, I'll get back here somewhere. Can't find myself here. We're here, I think. No, we're here. So, apologies. I guess these things happen. They seem to happen to me more than most people. So where am I? So, and the conservative government in particular picked up on this. And I've heard Poilievre say that stop the carbon tax because you're driving low-income people into poverty, having to choose between buying groceries or paying the rent, which is a load of nonsense because the low-income people get a set amount rebate on their taxes every year. So in fact, if you cut out the carbon tax, they're the ones you'll be hurting the most. And they overlook the fact that fossil fuels raise the price every year between December and May or June. From 21 to 22, the price raised by $80, 80 cents per liter. And we all felt that. And I don't think you really felt the extra 4 cents added on the 1st of April. The second thing was mandating EVs by, just mention the carbon tax again. I don't think it's going to do a damn thing because people still, even with the fossil fueling increasing their prices every year, we still do lots of driving in the summertime. So it isn't going to do anything in the end. But mandating EVs by 2035, that will make a difference because 25% of our emissions are from vehicles. Now, I think that includes, that's transportation and probably includes aircraft, ships, and all of that. But probably somewhere around 20% is actually from cars and trucks, anything that drives on the highway. And so by mandating that, you have the potential to remove 20% of emissions just from that. Then there's carbon dioxide sequestration. They make a big deal about this, planting 2 billion, well, it was millions, and I thought it was 2 to 3 million trees, but now they're talking 2 billion trees to sequester carbon dioxide. Maybe Prime Minister Trudeau saw one of my 3 letters to him in the last couple of years, although I doubt it, but where I criticize, the fact that planting those trees isn't going to make an iota of difference. So now they're talking 2 billion. And then direct air capture of carbon dioxide and carbon capture at source. And this last one, number 5, is a total waste of money and they should not be doing it. And yet they're giving all kinds of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry to develop carbon capture and storage. And just a reminder here, global emissions are 40 gigatons. That's 40 followed by 9 zeros. And Canada's emissions 730 followed by 6 zeros. Just keep that in mind. Trees sequester carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, of course. And the amount, this is what Brian Barge and I worked on a couple of years ago. The weight of the carbon in the tree is a little less than half of their dry weight, which is carbon. So when you plant a new tree, you're planting a seedling, which is less than a year old. It sequesters about 30 grams of carbon, or about 0.0001 ton per year. Not very much. When they're 50 years old, they, on average, they sequester 17 kilograms, which is 0.017 ton per year. These data and that Brian and I got were garnered from forestry research institutes. Oregon is one of them, and the rest were mostly in Canada, I believe. So they're kind of statistical averages, but they work out pretty well. So fir trees require 50 to 100 years to mature. And the government should be keeping that in mind when they allocate planting trees to counter carbon emissions, not doing a thing to current emissions. So just to throw some numbers in here, the number of 50-year firs to counter 730 megatons of carbon dioxide, Canada's emissions, would be about greater than 4 trillion trees. They're not going to plant that many. The number of trees required to sequester global emissions would be more than 235 trillion trees. And I have to remind you that the present number of trees on Earth numbers only about 3 trillion, and that's a number of forestry research institutes have done those estimates from satellite data and calibrating it on the surface. So a foolish thing to try and counter carbon emissions by planting trees. Now, eventually we do need those trees to help draw down carbon out of the atmosphere, but it's going to take centuries not years or even decades. It will take centuries to help do that. Here's just a quick graph I did of some of the numbers that we drew out. And this, the y-axis here is millions of trees to sequester 1 megaton of carbon dioxide. So I'll just, that 500 number, I added the zeros in there to show you that it's 500 million, not just 500. And this is the tree age. This is for firs and maples that we looked at here. So you're talking about 5-year trees. It'd take approximately 500 million of them. There's no possible way we can plant that number of trees, right? And if it's maples, well, it's even more. It just disappears into infinity here. It starts to make a difference if you have 25 or 30-year-old trees down in here. I won't say any more at the moment, but it requires 30 million trees to counter 1 megaton of carbon emissions, 15-year-old trees. Okay, technology. First of all, direct air capture of carbon. And the best project here that I could find were by the Swiss, and they went to Iceland and put in their system, they call it Orca, just northeast of Reykjavik, and it's in an area where there's loads of geothermal energy, as you can see in the picture here. And that was so that they weren't running anything that gave off carbon dioxide emissions or any other emissions from their facilities. So that was a good idea. However, Orca captures up to 4,000 tons of carbon per year, which seems like a lot, but it really isn't. And so they alongside it, just over to the right there, they built another facility. They call it Mammoth, which is capable of capturing up to 35,000 tons of carbon per year. So how many Mammoth type facilities would be required to counter current global emissions? Well, we do that very quickly as well. It's just very simple arithmetic. You're talking of more than 1 million of these mammoths. And to construct one of these things, the estimated construction costs, and this was given by the project itself, at $400 per ton. So multiply that number by $400 and you got a pretty amazing figure of dollars required. But appreciate the fact that both Orca and Mammoth use geothermal energy to run, hence no emissions. But it makes no sense to build all of these now because they're not going to do anything. But what they do need to do is continue research on this and try to raise capture rates to something like, and it may seem impossible, 1 to preferably 10 million tons per year before building more of these. And then you'd have something that might work. So maybe the technology will come up with something eventually for that, but we're talking about later in this century, and it's not going to help counter carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon capture and storage and source. That's the biggest greenwashing technology that I've heard of yet, actually. I'll start with Saskatchewan Boundary Dam. This was a coal-fired plant producing electricity in central Saskatchewan there. And they started it up in the early 2000s, reported 15 tons per day or 5,500 tons per year. They shut it down in 2018, and they might as well, because really, instead of taking this is the facility here, instead of taking the carbon dioxide and storing it deep underground, they pipelined it out into southeastern Saskatchewan to pump it underneath oil and gas wells there to improve their efficiency. But you can imagine if you can get oil seeping up through all those layers, that carbon dioxide, which is down there as a liquid, will change to a gas, and it will also see. In other words, all of the carbon they captured goes back into the atmosphere. No help there. So it's really what I call CCU, the utilization of the carbon captured, not stored. Shell developed a fairly impressive, I suppose, facility. They call it Quest near Edmonton. Edmonton is down here on the map. This is Fort Saskatchewan, and it's a few kilometers northeast of there where they have it set. And this place here, it doesn't show the pipeline coming from Fort McMurray, but it's taking oil sands oil and upgrading it. So they have an upgrader there and they have a refinery. Yes, I have a picture here of it, the facility here. And then they take the oil, or sorry, the carbon dioxide that they take out of it and compress it into a liquid form and then pipeline it up to this location here. Let's go to that. So this is the project overview. There's the capture process, compression into a liquid, put into a pipeline, and then sent up for storage. And this is a simulation of the storage area here, where I believe, I can't remember how far underground, that's something like 1.5 kilometers, I believe, underground. Through all these layers of soil and then clay, and I guess these are shale layers here, and then hard rock in those layers. So they bring it down below that. And I mean, if that's what they actually do at this facility, it's a good thing to do. But they claim they captured 5 million tons of carbon dioxide in the 5 years, 17 to 22. So that's 1 million tons per year, which sounds impressive. But it's been reviewed, the whole project, by this organization, Global Witness, and they're a well-respected NGO formed in 1993. They do other things besides looking at carbon capture, but they found out that the facility itself emitted 7.5 million tons of carbon dioxide during the same period. So this is a net increase in the amount of carbon dioxide. And Shell's plant has the same carbon footprint then as, they say, 1.25 million internal combustion engine vehicles. So there is a waste of money right there. This is Shell's, you can go to that. I'm not going to go there now, to this, their website. So they're saying that there are 20, well, they say 20 to 30. I can't get the exact number, but I hit upon 27 as an average. Similar CCS facilities globally, with 150 others being constructed. Well, somewhere on my desk here, I've got piles of research papers, and there's one dated 2008 where they said 20 to 30 CCS facilities with 150 others being constructed. In other words, they're saying the same thing for 15 years. Most have been built primarily with government grants. All are owned and operated by the fossil fuel industry, and that tells me there's a conflict of interest there. Why not have an independent government agency or something come in to analyze it? Most have been used as CC, carbon capture and utilization, to improve the efficiency of oil and gas wells. Whatever the oil industry does, their mandate is to always make a profit, and we need to understand that. And they will make a profit out of anything. They claim they can increase carbon capture at all of these facilities to 1 million tons per year. Well, and here's the cost in terms of dollars for Quest. It costs 1.35 billion. Federal government put in 655 million, and Alberta 745 out of their funds. So Shell's cost was $0, or approximately $0, but they own it and operate it. And operations, well, let's just assume they could capture 1 million tons per year. The number of facilities needed to capture and store annual global emissions, because this is what they claim, they're going to counter global emissions. So I'm taking them at their word. 40 billion, divided by 1 million tons per year means they'd need 40,000 of these to counter global emissions. And who would build these, and how long would they be in construction? At least a decade, I'm sure. And if carbon emissions are eventually eliminated, as we know we need to do, what would you do with these things after? They'd be a total waste of money, and they're not going to counter any emissions. So we turn now to renewable energy and the global share of electricity generated by source. Fossil fuels currently are up to, what is that, about 2022 or so, have 60% of the market share of electricity generation. And solar and wind, just taking those two alone, have less, well, about 12% then. And now by 2023, I read a number of 15%. So they're on target. And it should become a faster exponential curve from here on in. So that by 2030, globally, we should be at least 40%. And that 40% replaces fossil fuels, primarily. So just to summarize the wrong approach. Well, first, the IPCC warned at least 45% reductions in emissions by 2030. And right on their main assessment report, they have written a subtitle or whatever: climate change is widespread, rapid, and is intensifying. Now, governments and most environmental organizations are crying out for government to legislate emission caps. But how much of a cap could you put on them? 10%, 90%, 10% will do nothing for global warming. 90% might do something. But if you suddenly were able to get the oil industry to reduce emissions by 90%, what you'd be doing is be shutting them down. And can you imagine the global economic breakdown that would occur if you did that? And besides, what you're doing there is joining fossil fuels, allowing more carbon emissions, and fighting against nature. Sequestration, plant trees, we found that that's not going to do anything to help reduce emissions, nothing significant. Sequestration, right, by direct atmospheric capture, we're nowhere near close to being able to do anything there. And using carbon capture and storage, a total waste of funds. None of these will work to counter emissions. Planting trees and DAC may be able to do that after when we've solved the carbon emissions problem, but it's going to take centuries to draw it down. What other options do we have? Well, getting on the right track with renewable energy. There's solar, there's wind, there's hydro, although we do not want any more large dams. We need to go to run-of-river hydropower, small units that could be used in a micro grid with perhaps solar and wind to provide a reliable source of energy. Geothermal could be added into the mix where it's possible. In some areas, we could be doing tidal. All of these, except tidal, are well established for over 100 years. We know exactly what they can do. We know exactly how much electrical power you can get out of them. Tidal needs more testing yet, but it could be thrown into the mix. But what you're doing with renewables is you're working with nature instead of against. And by combining two or more renewables, you have a reliable source of energy in microgrids. Because the first thing, when these were brought out, the first thing the fossil fuels said, hey, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, so it's a waste of time, and we don't have any means to store electricity. All of those things have been removed. We have excellent storage facilities now. Ask Art Hunter. He does it on his own with his own microgrid. And the beauty of these is that you develop these locally. In other words, ignore fossil, in the end, we'll probably have to ignore fossil fuel industry, even ignore governments. This can be done at the municipal level, or people building a new subdivision, let's say, or a new shopping center or something. You could put in a microgrid and be self-sufficient in energy. Just to summarize, I hope we're doing okay with time. Reasons not to convert to renewables. There are none. There's no reason not to convert. Renewables will and are catching on quickly because they work with nature instead of fighting against nature. You're, all of the renewable energy is ultimately provided by the sun, right? The technologies are well understood and well developed. You don't have to do development work. And for any given renewable, technicians know exactly what power it will provide. They're relatively cheap to construct. I saw one report where they put in, anyway, primarily the basics for solar wind towers, 8 or 9 of them in a little over a week. Now, it probably took more time to get them up and running and everything, but not that much. They're cheap and quick and relatively and quick and easy to construct. They have low maintenance costs, few moving parts, and all provide clean, cheap energy. And the big thing is 0 greenhouse emissions. And this one we don't talk so much about, but we should. No air pollutants. I always distinguish between greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. Because, for example, carbon dioxide, you can open a tin of pop and you get more carbon dioxide you ingest into yourself than you'll ever breathe out of the atmosphere. And it doesn't hurt you, right? So, but air pollutants, carbon monoxides, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, those are deadly pollutants and threats to our health. I'd rather have healthy air with 0 greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea would be to ignore pressure from the fossil fuel industry. You develop these things locally and let market forces eventually result in driving fossil fuel demand down, which would eventually or very quickly force fuel supply down, which will reduce carbon emissions, 50% by 2030, 90 to 95% by 2040. It's simple. There's the answer. However, it's not happening enough. Some say that a solar or wind farm are not very pleasing aesthetically. These are the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And I don't know, they may be right, but that doesn't bother me. So for those people, we can offer them Fort McMurray if they think that's more aesthetically pleasing. A famous person once said, I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. Well, that wasn't exactly a few years ago. It was over a century ago, and it was none other than Thomas Edison said that in 1900. At the time, the few motor vehicles they had were run by electricity. And then Henry Ford and others came along less than a decade later and changed everything over into fossil fuels for the energy supply. I'm not going to show the details of this. These are the climate impacts I talk about in my talks, invited talks to public. And what I always emphasize is that the impacts of global warming are worse in the subtropics. And yet these are the people least responsible for carbon emissions. That honor belongs to us in the mid-latitude industrial countries. So a question I ask is, I have to move things again here so I can see my, but anyway, what legacy are we going to leave to future generations? And the reason why I say that, and the very reason I keep doing this, I'm 79 now, but I'll keep doing this as long as I can, because I now have 4 great-grandchildren. I'm sorry, every time I think of them, I break down like that. Apologies. But I think of that every night before I can get to sleep. Some nights it keeps me awake for a long time, worrying about what their life will be like when they hit their early 30s, which will be sometime shortly after 2050. What legacy are we leaving them? So a caution, don't put much, this is my last slide, I think. Don't put much reliance on governments and or new technology to solve the crisis. New technology isn't going to do it. Old technology, as we talked about, renewals can, maybe. And if you recall the last 28 COP meetings, including the one of last month, where most governments fail every one of their promises, that isn't going to change, I don't think. We need to relearn how to work with nature instead of fighting against it. And renewable energy systems are being initiated at local levels with microgrids. Like I said, municipal governments or smaller groups developing this, and eventually they can tie their microgrid in with the major grid. If governments get together, provincial and federally, and decide on how to upgrade the major grid, because that must be done. But these microgrids can operate on their own if necessary. Just like this lady is telling her neighbor, it dries the washing using the very latest technology, a combination of solar and wind power. And how right she is. I guess I went for an hour there, or just about. I'm turning it over to you again, Bob.
Okay, I'm back here. I hope you can still hear me. I had a slight microphone issue while you were talking.
Sorry?
Can you hear me all right?
Think
Can
so.
you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good. You're
Good, okay. We have a number of questions and a number of comments. My first question will be my own, because this is a prerogative of the host here doing the questions. And I'll be followed by, let's see, we have Ray Lurie. Ray Lurie has a number of comments. Our next question is from Ray Murphy. He'll be on deck. And then there's one from Dave Doherty, and he'll be following Ray Murphy. So we'll go on from there afterwards. I'll sort through the rest of the chat. Geoff, my question is easy, really. You mentioned at the end your great-grandchildren, and I mentioned at the beginning grandchildren, and they are focused for sure on how we're going to handle things going forward. And KCOR, from my brief involvement with them, is strongly looking for a way to communicate this message to people that need it communicated to, the ones that are advocating strong growth and continued business as usual. So I thought possibly your first two books had a good chance of communicating to these grandchildren, because they're all reading now, some of them, maybe not the great-grandchildren, but the grandchildren are reading, and I'm hoping the communications lines are there. Now, my question is, how have the Amazon sales of your first two books gone? Now, can you give any feedback at all as to who you may be reaching with these very excellent novels?
Well, I've had comments come back from, and they've all been positive anyway. But you have to remember that your children and your grandchildren are probably the last ones that listen to you, right?
True.
We're old and know nothing.
Well, thanks, Geoff. Ray Murphy, I believe, is on deck. I hope he's still with us. I found him in the chat and then lost him, but he had to talk about the high fossil fuel activities of the affluent society. I think it's a very good question. Ray, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
I can hear you clearly.
Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank Geoff for a very interesting presentation. My question is, and perhaps it would be better asked to your co-author, who isn't here today, but still, I'll ask it all the same. The former mayor of Toronto, David Miller, who is now the president of the Big Cities Climate Action Group, when he gave his presentation about a year and a half ago, he argued at a KCOR presentation that demand for fossil fuel energy has to be reduced. That is, drive less, fly less, cruise less, etc. But they're all increasing. So fossil fuel energy, the last time I looked at the statistics, it remains stuck at about 80% of global energy consumption. So my question basically is, do the affluent, with their high fossil fuel activities, have to be blamed too? You blame the fossil fuel energy and the governments, etc., but do the affluent have to be blamed as well? I think of China, for example. 30, 40 years ago, we used to see them pedaling around on their bicycles, and China didn't have a lot of emissions. And now China has become a very prosperous country. Its birth rate has been reduced dramatically. In fact, its population is decreasing, and yet its emissions have exploded. So is affluence not the problem? Because the Chinese now are flying and cruising and driving, just like the affluent everywhere. So my question is, do the affluent have to be blamed as well?
Well, I'll just remind you of the population difference that you're talking about. They're among the lowest per capita emitters of carbon dioxide.
That's true.
Whereas Canada is about at the maximum. But the Chinese are also further ahead than any other country in developing renewable microgrids. So keep that in. And to put it in context, this is why I don't think things are going to change. I don't know why environmental agencies and individuals continue to pester the government to put the cap on emissions by the fossil fuel sources. And that's what they're planning to do. But that's what I say, we need to develop renewable energy isolated from all of that. Develop them at the local level. That way fossil fuels are not able to attack you, not really. And that's happening in a lot of places. And Ontario, I know, is big on developing renewables. And certainly here in BC we are. And believe it or not, the biggest fossil fuel producer in the country, Alberta, has the largest amount of solar and wind farms. But at the moment, they put a moratorium on it because Premier Smith is getting nervous about losing fossil fuels.
Could I just make one additional comment on that? I think China could be considered as two different countries. You get 1 billion poor people with very low fossil fuel emissions, and then you get 400 million of the prosperous who are producing a huge amounts of emissions. And the result is, you know, the per capita emissions is less in China in general than in, let's say, Canada with high per capita emissions. But still, it's the affluent part of China that's causing the problem as far as climate change is concerned.
There's a reason by itself for getting rid of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You start cutting down their supplies, and China could, I'm sure they could revert to renewable energy faster than any other country in the world, just like they built up their economy and their industry. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for your response.
You're most welcome.
Okay, we have next on coming up is Dave Doherty, who did ask a question near the end. He had some comments earlier, but he didn't want me to bother with those. However, Dave has a question, and then followed by Dave will be another question from Fred Stoss. I hope Fred is still around, and we'll hear now from Dave and Fred Stoss on deck.
Great, thanks, Bob. Very interesting talk, Geoff. Thank you very much. A couple of the comments that I put in updated some of the information that you have, and if there's time later, we might go over them. But my question is this one. What is the potential for wave-powered and current-powered electrical generation in addition to the tidal energy that you mentioned?
I think it has plenty of potential. There's we couldn't use up all of the solar energy that hits on the earth. Not possible to use it all. But wait, I didn't get. Were you talking about solar and wind power and tidal? You said.
Oh no, wave powered and current.
Oh, wave power.
Because there are places where at least experimental installations have been made that generate power from waves going up and down, for example, on the Scottish coast. And there are some places where current power could be harnessed. One example, although you might have some trouble with the ferries that move through there, is Active Pass off the coast of Vancouver Island. Extremely high and regular currents go through there.
Yeah, of course. I thought years ago they talked of putting in tidal power in the Bay of Fundy, which has the highest tides in the world. I don't know if that ever happened. And
yeah, it did happen, but they had a failure, and and the machine got removed. I think you can still see that one actually at the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. But I think there is a second project that has either been planned or perhaps even installed there.
Well, that certainly has a lot of potential because you have two peaks of power with two tides every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
I,
they do have operating generating stations in Europe for that kind of power. But I'm specifically interested in wave power and current power as opposed to tidal power, because there are many places where there's a very strong ocean current, and you could do the same thing in rivers. There's very strong current flow that could easily be harnessed.
yeah, I haven't looked into that myself. I've seen lots of places where they put wind power towers on the ocean itself.
Yeah.
But wave power would carry a lot more energy, you would think. But
Yeah. Okay, so Bob, perhaps later I can come back and get to the couple of things that I did type in earlier, but I do want to make one comment about solar, wind, and actually geothermal in Alberta. I looked into that about 10 years ago and sent a note to the government of the day, which was an NDP government, and even that government wasn't interested. Alberta has enough potential to power all of Western Canada.
yeah, that's true. But their focus has always been on oil, right? In government.
Well, it hasn't always been in oil because prior to approximately 1900, they didn't know there was oil and gas there. They did have the Turner Valley oil strike, and then later they had the strike near Leduc. So Alberta when I first went to Alberta in the 70s, oil was the 5th biggest industry, and it's number 1 now. It doesn't have to remain so.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thanks. And thank you for your confirmation of the 1.5 degrees. I guess it's 1.48, which is close enough for me. I made a guess at it. Bob?
You're right on, Jeff. Okay, Fred Stoss, I'm not sure if he had an exact question, but I think we'll let him come next.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Sorry, Art Hunter will be on deck.
Okay. The question I raised, I just said, what about China and India? Now, you addressed, I think, quite adequately the per capita differences between India and China and the developed world. I work at the University at Buffalo, so we have some very similar per capitas. But the problem is that per capita numbers stay low because their population is increasing, which is driving their energy demands. And most of their energy is not coming from what I would call clean sources. While they are China at least is way up there in terms of developing technologies, they may be leveling off. But India is still rampantly growing population-wise, and have had to put old coal-fired power plants back on. They're using a dirty coal, and their emission rates are going up, just as China's have gone up since at least here in the United States, we've probably decreased our emissions by 15-20% over 25 years. So what about what is happening or needs to happen? The one problem, nobody wants to talk about population, and I'll just sit back and listen now.
Yeah, well, I would question that 15% decrease in emissions. What they report anyway is 15% in Canada and the US. But before we criticize a country like China, which has such, or India, which have such large populations and have a very low per capita, we should be cleaning up our own backyard first, because Canada, Australia, and the US have been at the top in per capita emissions for far too long, and still are. But I couldn't comment any more past that. I tend to focus on the science and impacts I see, and less on the technology. Dave Doherty knows more about the technology than I do. So go ahead, Bob.
Okay, thank you very much, Fred. And we have now Art Hunter with a question on geothermal and on deck. I think we're going to ask Ray Lurie to perhaps condense some of his comments and formulate a nice question for Jeff. But he certainly had a lot of comments. So Ray will be on deck. Art, go ahead.
Is this Raymond Lurie or?
Yeah, Raymond will be on deck, but we have Art Hunter. He has a question right now on geothermal stuff. So Art, go ahead.
Okay, and I hope you can hear me, but you've made passing comment on geothermal, and when in fact geothermal is available everywhere 24 hours a day. It doesn't depend on the solar cycle around the Earth, and it's near infinite as well. And in fact, what happens is, at least in my home, and according to studies that have been going on in other countries, that 80% of energy in a building goes to heating. And so the real question that I have is, if we're focused in 80% of our energy usage is heat, why is it that everybody is so focused on generating electricity from the sun when you can just go and get the heat you need from the ground?
Good question.
You mean, why not talk more about geothermal? Is that the question, or?
Yes, indeed.
Well, I don't think with renewables, you should rely on any single renewable. Because it's true that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and some areas are not good for geothermal and others are. So you need a combination, I think. And you know that, Art. You need two or more renewables to give yourself reliable source of energy, I believe.
Well, absolutely. And my issue is more that geothermal is normally just totally ignored.
Well, in fact, if you're constructing a new house and you're having a foundation, you dig out the foundation, you might as well dig a room at the same depth for drawing on geothermal energy for the winter time. Right?
Absolutely, 100% correct.
Nobody's
doing it.
Do it after the fact, but it makes sense to do it when you're building new.
Okay, thank you. I think I've made my point. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Ray Lurie, and on deck then a final comment perhaps from Dave Doherty, who has asked for it. And then the last speaker will probably be Ted Manning, because he has a big comment here and he's going to be doing the thank you. So I think that'll be a good order to go with from here. So how about right now we have Ray Lurie.
Ray, before you speak, I just wanted to compliment you on your talk last week. Anyone who didn't see it on EVs, you really should go to the website and see the
Chiefs are going to play a single digit temperature.
Fred is not on mute.
We get people that have their audio left on to shut it down. Yeah. Go ahead, Ray.
Thanks. Actually, the talk last week did talk about EVs, but I talked about other stuff in terms of solar and wind deployment and all that, right? One thing I want to say is I've been asked to do another follow-on presentation next month where I'm going to talk about the other stuff that I didn't talk about in terms of decarbonization. But, Art is right that what Art means is two things there. Sometimes people don't quite get what he means there. So when he's talking about geothermal, he's talking about ground source heat pump type of technology. But there's other technologies where we could use the oil and gas expertise to dig very deep wells to get to very hot rock, which there's a potential to get the heat out of there to actually produce electricity, right? Because if you want to produce electricity with geothermal, you need a large temperature difference, right? So, but the problem there is the same problem as with tide, wave, current, and all those things. Is how do you make that happen in a way that's economically viable, right? And it's difficult to do that. There are a lot of projects, and Dave put a few links there. There's a lot of projects that are trying to do that, and like I say in the comment, it's very hard to put what's essentially a steel device of some sort into salt water and have it last a long time, right? So the engineering challenges are pretty hard to overcome, but there are people working on it, and I certainly hope that comes to fruition, because if you look at particularly the currents and the tides, those are very predictable, right, and very reliable. So so there's a lot of advantages in wanting to implement those. But and back to India for a second. So I just looked up the birth rate for India, the fertility rate, and it's actually 2.02, which is less than we need, or 2.03, which is less than we need to replace the population, right? So India will start diminishing in population. And if you look at other things that are happening in India, the 2-wheel and 3-wheel vehicles in India, last number I saw is 40% of the new ones are actually electric. So they're already doing a lot of stuff to get away from fossil fuels. So I'm hopeful that that India is going to do much better, and same with China. So I visited China about 5 years ago, and in the cities that I was in, all the 2-wheel vehicles that I could find, with very few exceptions, were all electric back then, right? So both those countries are doing a lot, and like I said earlier, I think given that we're the worst ones, we should be doing the most to to do our part to reduce emissions.
Yeah, because we pride ourselves as being, the technology experts in that, but there's expertise in other parts of the world that our governments don't often recognize.
Seeing the time, I think we may have time to squeeze in one other questioner. And the reason I want to squeeze him in, John Hollins has got a comment about the carbon tax, because John Hollins is another CMOS transporter into CACOR, and he also is one of the more energetic communicators. Even today, he has a letter to the editor published in The Citizen, which my wife spotted. So I'd like to put John in if we could. Dave Doherty, though, had one more comment. Then we would have John, and finally Ted Manning. How does that order sound, everybody? Can we do it?
Sounds good. I'll keep mine short. A couple of confirmations. 2023 was plus 1.48 degrees from the baseline, which is circa 1850. It's less if you look at 1900 or 1950, which some people do. It was, in fact, the warmest year on record.
By a long shot.
Sorry, by a long shot? Yes, indeed. And the oceans are by a long shot the hottest that we've ever measured them. There is an explanation in one of the links that I had about why it is that while water vapor is a very important greenhouse gas, it isn't the one on which we concentrate when we're looking at climate change, because it stays in the atmosphere for such a short period of time. And then regarding emissions, I did some research on that about a year ago. I'm sure that the situation has really not changed significantly. Canada is in the top 10 per capita, but we are also in the top 10 total. So given that we've got somewhere close to 40 million people, and countries like China and India have 1.5 billion people, it's a little bit surprising that we are in there as high as we are.
Not to be,
that's just
nothing
wrong.
to be proud of. I say nothing to be proud of.
Yeah, indeed. And so one last comment is I hope that your fiction books are selling better than mine.
No, they're not. But you mentioned very high water temperatures, and that was one of the key things in my first novel as well. Talking about what happens in the southeast U.S. offshore when water temperatures get up as high as they are now, and you get all these additional storms.
Yeah, well, you probably saw some of the monitoring that was going on the west coast of Florida last summer. It was the hottest they'd ever found, and it was higher than human body temperature in some of the shallower bays, right? At 2 meters. That's not right at the surface. It's 2 meters depth where they do their monitoring.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all.
Thanks.
Okay, John Hollins, you had a comment, a question.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I just have a couple of small comments. The seawater is an extremely hostile environment for anything, whether it contains steel or even plastics. Most projects that I'm aware of have not succeeded for very long. The European tidal plant you talked about is in the mouth of the river La Rance on the north coast of France. It was built in 1966. It's 240 megawatts when it's running at full power, which of course is only a very few hours a day. But it's still working. In in the electrical budget of France, it's trivial. You also talked about carbon. Look, sorry, I've got a phone and I'm not muted anymore. We have a political, social problem here, not just a problem of greedy fossil fuel companies. Although, thank you, Geoff and Raymond and Art. I drew on your paper, your article in the Tyee to write a letter to the citizen about the importance of reducing the use of fossil fuels, which got published yesterday morning, along with another along with another letter with the same message. I'll send that around. We have a parliament which is full of lawyers and almost no scientists or engineers, and they have an enormous agenda. I don't have the foggiest idea how to deal with that, but it's much more than just the greedy fossil fuel companies, I'm afraid. The one thing that our federal government has done, following the example of BC, is put a carbon tax on. That was done, I think, in 2016 in the early going. Can I just show you a picture why I think that doesn't matter? Is that all right? Let me go here.
That's fine by me. Bob is the host here. So.
Look, this is the moving price of gasoline at the pump in Victoria, BC, just down the road from you. Mm-hmm. And it covers just the last very few years. It's gone from 96 cents a litre up as high as 230 something cents a litre, and currently is on a downward trend here. The carbon tax that was introduced is currently, I think, at 14 cents a litre. The market changes the price by more than that several times a year. People don't notice the change at the pump. The increase on April the 1st of last year was actually masked by a movement in the market of more than the 3 or 4 cents that it increased. This is the level of thinking of our political world. It just doesn't work. So it's a bit late for you and me to run for political office, but the solution is at best a long-term one, and involves knowledgeable people who understand the much wider range of factors than the people we've elected in the last many decades. So sorry, that's a little rant. Let me turn my share screen off, if I can find out how to do that.
The carbon tax, to me, doesn't do a darn thing. And I don't care if Poilievre does remove it if he gets in, but it'll only hurt the lower income people. Bob?
Yeah, I think we're reaching the time magic. I see my watch says 3:01, and I think it's probably the appropriate time for Ted Manning to take over. And Geoff, I really appreciated your talk today. I think it was wonderful, and it certainly added to the other one and confirmed everything we're hearing. It's not good news. So let's have Ted on to say a little bit more to you about it. And thanks again. Ted?
Thank you. Well, I'm really here to thank Geoff, but I have one comment. Many of you know that at the Club of Rome, we're working hard to try and get the prime objective of growth and greed to be replaced by something that is more related to the long-term well-being of humanity on the planet. And this kind of fits there, because the more I look at it, we are very aware that a lot of technical solutions are being developed, and much fewer right now sociological solutions. And I'm a geographer, and I want to look one place at a time. And generalizing about entire countries or entire continents or the globe is very, very vexing for me, because the whole system and how it's working between people and their demands and their use of energy and so on is very different from place to place, as is population and so forth. The models that work in one place don't necessarily transfer to others. So I'm just making an argument that when we talk about the main driving forces of consumption and of political bent and of the types of opportunities for the use or not use of fossil fuels, it's very, very location sensitive. And probably we need to look in much greater detail at where the opportunities are and where the real challenges are. And as a geographer, I like playing with maps and I like overlaying things, and you always can learn something. And sometimes you can even find solutions that may be more suitable to one place than to another. Anyway, Geoff, you've made it very clear that what is happening is important, that we have serious challenges globally, and also that there are some promising solutions if only we can get people to listen. And as a scientist who did work in government for a while, and then I gave up and went away and started my own company, I understand exactly how frustrated we are without being able to get the people making the decisions to listen to us. And that's one of the mandates we have at the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, to try and get a voice where it's needed, like some of our people have done already, and like Ray and like John and so on. And I think we should continue to support them as much as we possibly can. So I would thank you, Geoff, for bringing some very interesting challenges in front of us. And I hope that everybody will realize that these things go much broader than just to our group, sometimes up to thousands of views when it gets on YouTube, and where we are actually hopefully bending minds to have them think that there are better solutions than the ones that our politicians and even ourselves are following. So I will thank Geoff for adding to the interesting conversations that we continue to have. I would ask everyone to subscribe to the YouTube channel for our stuff. All of the, or almost all of the presentations, close to 170 now, I think, of them are there. Many of them are excellent, and if you missed them, go and look for them. And I've also asked those of you who are not yet members of KCOR, please join us. We need a few bucks out of you every year just to make sure we can keep doing these, and so that we can have good arguments with each other. So thank you again. And I hope you have a very good weekend, and we'll see you next week. And also right now, I would ask that we get rid of the, or that we stop the recording, because we can go for a little while longer to just share other ideas. So once again, thanks for coming, and KCOR will benefit a lot from you guys sticking around and putting forward very good ideas.